Alright guys, welcome back to Unit 3. We are moving on to Day 7. So now that we've wrapped up writing our Constitution and we've got it ratified, if you remember I said it only took 9 states for the Constitution to go into effect. So now that 10 states have ratified it, we can start working as a federal government under the framework of the Constitution. So in February of 1789, we'll start to see things happening on the federal level. George Washington is going to be unanimously elected the first president of the United States, and John Adams will serve as his vice president. He will be inaugurated in April of 1789 and begin to work. Now, he knows that he doesn't know everything there is to know about economics, foreign policy, military stuff, the law. He can't possibly know everything there is to know about everything. Nobody can. And it's important that the president has a solid team of advisors capable of advising him on specific topics so that he can make educated decisions as the leader of our country. So he's going to form a group that he calls the cabinet, the presidential cabinet. And these are going to be heads of all the departments in the executive branch. Now today, we've got over 20 different members of the cabinet. There are lots of things that didn't exist when George Washington created his cabinet, like Secretary of Education, Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. All of that stuff is new. I mean, even Secretary of Homeland Security is actually the newest position, which was created after 9/11. George Washington will actually only create 4 departments with 4 different heads to join his cabinet. The first will be the State Department. So the head of the State Department is known as the Secretary of State. This person handles foreign policy. Thomas Jefferson will serve as our first Secretary of State. The second department is going to be the Treasury Department to handle all of our finances. The head of that department will be the Secretary of Treasury, and Alexander Hamilton will serve as our first Secretary of Treasury. The third department will be the War Department. Now today we don't have the War Department. We have the Department of Defense because Department of War sounds a lot more aggressive. So eventually we'll change the name, but it's essentially the same department. And our first Secretary of War will be Henry Knox. Then finally, we have the Legal Department, the Office of the Attorney General. And our first Attorney General will be Edmund Randolph. So now we've got the executive branch all squared away. They're going to be working. They're going to be doing things for the executive branch. As for the legislative branch, they know what they need to get done. They've all been in Congress before. So they're actually going to start meeting before all 13 states ratify the Constitution. We'll only have actually representatives from 10 states present at the first Congress. And we'll have our Vice President, John Adams, presiding over the Senate. Now, their first task is actually going to be having to do with the judicial branch. The Constitution says that we have a judicial branch, and it says that it's meant to interpret laws and things like that, but it doesn't say the structure of the court system. It doesn't say how many men are on the Supreme Court, if there's a Chief Justice, how long they serve. It doesn't say any of that. So we have to pass a bill. Congress is going to have to pass a bill basically explaining all of this and laying all of this out for the future. So they're going to pass a bill called the Judiciary Act of 1789, which organizes the judicial branch of the federal government. We're going to create a 6-person Supreme Court with 5 associate justices and 1 chief justice. Today, our chief justice is a guy named John Roberts, and we have 9 members of the Supreme Court, so it's very different now. But back then, we had just had 6, 5 associate judges, and then the chief justice, and our first chief justice will be John Jay, if you remember him from writing the Federalist Papers. That bill also sets up our district courts and our appellate courts for the federal level of government. So one of the first things that our executive branch is going to have to handle is our current economic situation, which is quite a tricky one. We owe money to other countries, to private lenders. We also have soldiers who haven't been paid from the American Revolution. And so Hamilton, who's in charge of all of our finances as the Secretary of Treasury, wants us to have financial stability, but wants to build up our credit rating at the same time. So he writes his own economic plan, which has 3 points. Number 1, a debt bill. He wants the federal government to absorb all the debt from all the states in the Revolutionary War. That way the states will not have any debt. It will just all be federal debt. Number 2, we need to create more of an income for the federal government, which means we're going to have taxes. He wants to impose 2 taxes, 1, a tariff, which is a tax on imports, and 2, an excise tax, which is a tax on very specific non-essential items. He's going to be taxing liquor, sugar, snuff, and carriages. Point number 3 of his economic plan is to establish a national bank. The purpose of this bank will be to control the credit of the nation and to make loans to the government. It will, make circulating money easier. It will make collecting taxes easier. It's just overall, in Hamilton's mind, a good idea. Now, all 3 of these parts are very, very controversial. A lot of people are upset about every single one of these pieces. Let's talk about the debt bill first. This is controversial for 2 reasons. Number 1, a bond controversy happening at the same time. If you don't know what a bond is essentially a loan from a citizen to the federal government. You give the government your money, they give you a bond. You can't get the money back right away. Let's say you give them $20 to buy a $50 savings bond. In 10 years, that $50 savings bond will actually be worth $50. So you can cash it in, get your money back, plus $30 worth of interest. Or you can wait even longer and collect even more interest on it. That's what a bond is. So we sold a lot of bonds during the American Revolution to try to pay for the war, with the promise that, in 20, 30 years, you could get your money back plus all of the interest because the bond would mature. Unfortunately, during the recession that we hit with Shays' Rebellion and all that, a lot of people sold their bonds to speculators who would buy their bonds for much less, but it would still allow them to get some of their money back right away. And then speculators could wait and hold on to those bonds and collect all of the interest for themselves later on. Now, under this economic plan, this debt bill would absorb state debts, which means that all of the bonds sold by states would have to be paid at face value immediately, giving the speculators all this profit and sort of, screwing over all of the citizens who felt like they had to sell their bonds just recently because of their dire economic situation, because they were under the impression that the bonds wouldn't be paid off for quite some time. As for the second part of the plan, this is controversial because Americans don't like taxes. That's no secret. And we are really not going to be a fan of Hamilton's new excise tax, but specifically we're going to be the most upset about the liquor tax, and I'll get to that later on. As for the third part of this plan, the national bank piece, a lot of people felt this is unconstitutional, specifically Thomas Jefferson. He really felt like, it doesn't say in the Constitution that the federal government has the power to erect a national bank. In his mind, that meant it didn't. And creating a national bank would make the federal government stronger, and that was something he definitely did not want. So we're going to have to come to some sort of agreement here. How is Hamilton supposed to get his financial plan through if he can't get any of Jefferson or James Madison or any of these other people to agree with him? So ultimately, he's going to have to start with the beginning, which is the debt bill. How can he get all of these people on board for the debt bill? Now, they're upset about the bond controversy, but they're also upset because the northern states have a lot less debt. The northern states have a lot more debt than the southern states. And if the federal government absorbs the debt, then everyone, including southern citizens and residents, would end up paying off the North's debt through federal taxes. They don't like that. Jefferson doesn't think that, Virginia should have to pay off New York's debt. It doesn't seem fair. So Hamilton strikes a deal with James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. And essentially what they agreed to is that in exchange for the southern states supporting the debt bill, by 1800, they will move the capital of the United States south to Virginia. Now, today we know the land that they used to create the capital from Virginia is going to be known as Washington, D.C. So that's the agreement. We'll move the capital to the south in exchange for passing the debt bill with Southern support. But Hamilton has 2 other really big pieces of this plan that he's going to have to work on, and it's going to be a tough road.